Well, good afternoon. It is Saturday, August 29th. So today we're going to look at a topic called Utopia. And this has very good application to the millennial kingdom. In a sense, it will be utopic, but not in reality. And we will look at some things just to help us to understand this. But Utopia, uh, under that topic, from the longest point back in antiquity, men have dreamed of a golden age. They have longed for a utopia. Man has desired an age of peace, an age when oppression would cease and injustice would be gone and war would end. Poets have written of it, singers have sung of it, and politicians have promised to bring it. Prophets have predicted it, the world has cried for it, but it doesn't come until Jesus comes himself. So as we look in history, this indeed has been a topic. Thomas More wrote an entire book on Utopia. And Adolf Hitler had many aspirations to his type of utopia. Thomas More said, "Nobody owns anything, but everyone is rich. For what greater wealth can there be than cheerfulness, peace of mind, and freedom from anxiety?" So he was kind of looking at it from a very spiritual type framework, almost a personal utopia, which still is beyond us at this point. Then Adolf Hitler said, "The precondition for the existence of a higher humanity," his term for utopia, "is not the state, but the nation possessing the necessary ability." And that was his whole goal with the Third Reich. And then we have old Karl Marx, and he had this utopian belief in a classless society, a perfect society with no inequality. And everyone should understand he is the father of communism. That's why the base teachings of communism is called Marxism. And he said education is free in his utopia. Freedom of education shall be enjoyed under the condition mixed by law and under the supreme control of the state. Interesting statement there, and this should raise red flags for all of us when we are looking at state-run education. Where did that idea come from? Well, Karl Marx. And then we have good old Soviet founders Lenin and Stalin. And Vladimir Lenin said, "Socialized medicine is the keystone to the arc of the socialist state." There's another red flag goes up immediately. But actually the one who saw it to somewhat of fruition was Stalin himself, and that's how they sold it to the people of Russia. But again, there's that caveat of all who disagreed, well, this is where they ended. And that's why people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and many who spent decades in Soviet gulags, they can attest to the brutality of the Soviet regime. But we need to go back even further and just have a brief history lesson to understand this utopian idea that seems to be taking even America by storm, or by riots, or by looting nowadays. And we just have to go back to the 1700s, the French Revolution, and it was not a crusade for religious freedom, but it was an effort to replace religion with reason and rationalism. And at the time, France had the largest population in Europe, but they had trouble feeding the masses. And you might ask why? Well, Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette and the French Roman Catholic cardinals, archbishops, bishops, abbots lived in unprecedented luxury, while the multitudes of locals, the local priests even, farmers, and whoever were not courtiers, lived in dire poverty. And all of this began with what is called the Reign of Terror, which was kicked off with the beheading of Marie Antoinette and Louis XIV. And a disciple of Rousseau helped form the French National Convention, and his name was Maximilien Robespierre. Basically a democratic socialist. You could fit him into that category. So his whole ideas were virtue in ethics. And here's one of the first big experiments trying to totally evict ethics from God, ethics from religious foundation, which in the end proved to not work. And Robespierre said, terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the patrie, which is the French word for the fatherland, who came in years later, Adolf Hitler. To punish the oppressors of humanity is clemency. To forgive them is barbarity. And that's extracted from one of his big speeches in February of 1794, where he was trying to usher in this age of reason. So between 1793 and 94, Robespierre governed France as a dictator, and which I said earlier became known as the Reign of Terror. Historians believe as many as 40,000 people were executed, and this included anyone thought to be loyal to the king or anyone that proved to be a problem for Robespierre. And this is a big warning flag here. Anytime this type of separation occurs, this type of rebellion, it almost always ends up in a type of dictatorship. So what he created out of this whole thing was what he called the cult of the supreme being. And his new trinity of this cult were liberty, equality, and fraternity. So the cult of reason was atheistic, secular religion to replace Christianity. In 1793, he erected a goddess of reason at Notre Dame, and he renamed it, of course, the Temple of Reason. And this is his goal, was to create this new cult, kind of a new religion. And he made it the national religion on May 7th, 1794. And then they had this huge festival of the Supreme Being. So on June 4th, 1794, Robespierre was almost unanimously elected president of the convention. 6 days later, a law was passed that suspended a suspect's right to public trial and to legal assistance. In just a month, 1,400 enemies of the revolution were guillotined. Interesting, we're seeing those guillotines being rolled back out again in our streets. Well, but in all of that, it didn't work. On July 27th of 94, in the revolutionary calendar, they called it the month of Thermidor. They even created a new calendar. Weird. But Robespierre and his allies were placed under arrest by the National Assembly. The next evening, July 28th, Robespierre and others were guillotined without a trial by laws that he put into place in the Place de la Révolution. During the next few days, another 82 Robespierre followers were executed. And with that, the reign of terror was at an end. So what he created came back to bite him. What he created became his undoing. It definitely didn't work. So in the aftermath of all of that, what was created was a committee of public safety, but it lost its authority. The prisons were basically emptied. We're seeing that today. The French Revolution became decidedly less radical. The directory of Robespierre's creation followed saw a return to bourgeois values, corruption, and military failure. Then in 1799, the directory was overthrown in a military coup led by, who could that be? But Napoleon Bonaparte. And this is where we get that term, coup d'etat. Napoleon left his army and returned to Paris. There he joined a conspiracy to conduct a coup, a plot to overthrow the directory, seize power, and establish a new government. And then, after a few years, Napoleon was crowned emperor. And he basically did this on his own efforts. He decided to make himself emperor. And in turn, the French supported him. Again, they didn't have any choice. He took the crown from the Pope, placed it on his own head. An act of arrogance showed that he was more powerful than the church, which is interesting because when he first took power in the coup, he reinstated all the offices of the church. But now that wasn't good enough for him. He's kind of a mini Antichrist, you could say. And amazingly, this is what we call the Enlightenment. There's your age of reason. And that's how it works when the sovereign God is left out. Well, J.C. Ryle had some comments about this type of stuff. He said, trials are intended to make us think, to wean us from the world, to send us to the Bible, to drive us to our knees. And then he said, beware of expecting a millennium to be brought about by any method of government, by any system of education, by any political party. Never forget that you live in a fallen world and that the devil is abroad. Be very sure that the rich man and Lazarus were emblems of two classes of people which will always be in the world until the Lord comes. So what does that leave us with? Two classes, believers and unbelievers. So inevitably, the only king and the only true king is Jesus. So I thought that would be helpful, just doing a little history lesson, just to kind of bring us up to speed on what has happened throughout history when mankind tries to solve the quote, the problems of society, or when mankind himself tries to bring about a utopia. But every person who's ever done that defines the utopia on his own standards, which should cause an issue right there. So I thank you for listening, and stay tuned for another lesson soon. And have a blessed weekend.